An example, you definitely don't ever want to be holding a sprocket by hand. You know, that's a recipe for a real bad time. But let's get back to our actual 2006 Electric Glide Classic that we're working on. So before we pull the rest of the seals out of the transmission, this is perfect time to go through and clean everything up. You know, any type of dirt, grease, rocks. There's always rocks stuck in here. And then I always clean up the area like the bracket that goes under the transmission to attach the two like lower frame sections together. But now's the perfect time to go around with the red Scotch Brite and some brake cleaner. And just clean everything up. Now that we're all cleaned up, we're going to pull off the little sprocket spacer. You can see one side's flat where the other side is concave. That's because there's a special little quad seal in there. I'm going to use this just generalized seal puller. I always place a rag under the side that you're hinging on. That way, if anything slips in, there's no way that the puller is going to damage like the aluminum bore or anything. But you pop the seal out of there. Then use a little pick, grab that old quad seal out of there. And then 99% of the time, this little pipe plug isn't leaking. But for the customer's benefit, I always replace it anytime that we're in here doing inner primary seals. That pipe plug comes out, and then a new one that already has like new special pipe sealant goes in. And then you run it in until it's flush with the surface of the transmission case. There's a shaft in there where all the shift forks ride on, so you don't want to go crazy and run that pipe plug like all the way in and bottom it out on the shaft. But then you'll want to use whatever type of main shaft race puller that you have. This is my favorite style. I've used this same puller like probably on 100 or 200 motorcycles. I've had it forever. It's a really heavy duty unit. I've only ever seen them sold through Harley Davidson specific tools like Kentmore. So I don't know if there's any aftermarket versions of this particular style, but there are other styles that are like a normal generalized puller that have two bolts off to the side. But I'll have all of that information in the description. But we're just going to slide this race off so then we can get to the seal that's right behind it. Before I pull the actual oil seal out, I'm going through with a small pick and some red Scotch Brite just to clean up the threads there, so that we don't have to do that when the seal's out and like toss a bunch of a dirt like and grit like into the needle bearings that are down in there. I'm just running the small pick down to the root of the thread just to help loosen up any of the rust or corrosion that's down in there. We'll clean it up a little bit, shoot it out of there with some brake cleaner. Now we're going to be using our shaft style seal puller. It has a real smooth bend on it so that we can get down and behind the rubber seal into the metal part of the seal, but it's not too long where it's going to gouge the bore when we pull it out of there. And since the main shaft is like super hard, this type of way of pulling the seal out doesn't scratch or damage the shaft at all. And then it just slides right out.
Gusto is easy, modern small business payroll. But it's so much more than.
And I like to go through and re-inspect everything, just make sure I didn't miss anything. All of the aluminum bores, they're really easy to get nicked. And if they get nicked, they're going to cut up the metal or the little seal that's on the metal part of the seal. And then I go around with a Q-tip, make sure that they're perfectly clean, that there isn't any type of trash or dirt or anything left in there. And if a bore is nicked, like in the aluminum part, then you can go in with one of those small like mini files and take out the high. Usually with a nick, like there'll be like a high sharp part of the nick. You can cut that down with a file and then buff it out with the red Scotch-Brite pad. So now we're going to get started on putting the oil seal in for the shaft seal. The way I like to protect the seal is I go just one loop of masking tape. You want to cover up the spline part of the shaft and also the little recess for the snap ring. Then I shoot a little oil on it. You put a little oil on the rubber part of the seal. And then we're going to use the 15/16 half-inch drive socket. It'll fit right over the shaft. And the seal gets driven in until it's flush with the rest of the machine surface of the transmission case. Then you go back and just find out where kind of like the first loop of the masking tape was, and it'll just slide right off. Clean up the washer, put the washer back on. Make sure that you get this little mini snap ring all the way back past the splines into the little groove that's built into it. I'll just snap right into place. And then we're going to get the main seal lubed up. We're going to lube up the inside of it and also the outside where it fits into the aluminum of the transmission case. And this is a super old tool that we have at the dealership. It really sucks. Like, it's so easy to put the seal in too far. So I sit here for a really long time and like kind of tap around the seal because the seal is supposed to sit flush with the transmission case, and it's a real pain in the butt like trying to pull the seal back out if you've driven it in too far. So it'd probably be a whole lot easier just to use like the bottom end of a 2x4 because you're just, you know, popping the seal in flush. So that's what I'm feeling for, is because it never drives it in perfectly square. Like, it'll always drive it in crooked. That is this particular driver. But that seems to be the way that this particular driver works. So it just is what it is. but that's what I'm doing. I'm feeling for the high spots, and then I'm tilting the installer and hitting it on the high spots until it's all level with the transmission case. Everything's looking good with that seal finally. So we're going to get the new quad seal, slide it on over, and I like to put it all the way back, like in its resting spot. So I'm just slightly depressing it with a screwdriver just to walk it back there. And then oiling up this new spacer. You want to be careful when you buy new ones because there's always like, when you buy a brand new one today, they seem to have like just crappy machining on them, so there's a rough edge on it. So I go by with like a carbide scraper and cut down the hard edge. But you just want to make sure that everything's like machined nice and smoothly there. And if you have to, you can buff it up a little bit with a red Scotch-Brite. Here we're going to be installing the main shaft oil seal using the Gems tool. It's a really nice tool. Definitely recommend it. It comes with this little cover that goes over the splines so it doesn't cut up the seal as you're trying to walk it on there. But we're going to oil up the seal both on the rubber part where it slides on the shaft and also on the outside of it so that it installs smoothly. The tool has a ledge on it, so you just tap on the tool until the tool bottoms out. That will correctly place the seal. And then we're going to install the new main shaft race. But before we get the race on there, I like to get in there with a flashlight and make sure that all of the seals look perfect, that there isn't anything weird or wonky looking about it.
Breaking news. If you're taking metformin or Ozempic, you need to see this. Did you know that type...
Because it's so much easier to go in there and everything's looking good with that seal finally. So we're going to get the new quad seal, slide it on over, and I like to put it all the way back, like in its resting spot. So I'm just slightly depressing it with a screwdriver just to walk it back there. And then oiling up this new spacer. You want to be careful when you buy new ones because there's always like, when you buy a brand new one today, they seem to have like just crappy machining on them, so there's a rough edge on it. So I go by with like a carbide scraper and cut down the hard edge. But you just want to make sure that everything's like machined nice and smoothly there. And if you have to, you can buff it up a little bit with a red Scotch-Brite. Here we're going to be installing the main shaft oil seal using the Gems tool. It's a really nice tool. Definitely recommend it. It comes with this little cover that goes over the splines so it doesn't cut up the seal as you're trying to walk it on there. But we're going to oil up the seal both on the rubber part where it slides on the shaft and also on the outside of it so that it installs smoothly. The tool has a ledge on it, so you just tap on the tool until the tool bottoms out. That will correctly place the seal. And then we're going to install the new main shaft race. But before we get the race on there, I like to get in there with a flashlight and make sure that all of the seals look perfect, that there isn't anything weird or wonky looking about it, because it's so much easier to go in there and replace something that got messed up on it installation now versus later. You can usually tell by the rubber, like if the rubber is like folded over weird or cut and flopped or hanging off or whatever. That rarely happens, but if you double check every single seal, then that's just going to make every job, go that much more smoothly. So everything's looking good there. This is the main shaft installer tool with the new race. You see it just kind of like threads on the end of the main shaft there. There isn't a step on the main shaft to prevent you from installing the race too far, like too deep. So what I do after I get the race going on, and then like it gets to be within a 1/4 inch of the main drive gear, then I put a piece of an old tool back there, which kind of correctly positions the race. But I'll show you on a just loosely on a micrometer like where about the race is supposed to be. So to have the race like correctly positioned, you're going to be looking at basically like 1/8 of an inch or 3 millimeters. And then we're going to get the shift lever installed back on the transmission. Now they aren't supposed to be installed like perfectly vertical, like at the 12 o'clock position. They're always one spline forward. Just heads up if you didn't notice when you were disassembling yours. I always install a new screw that comes with a lock patch on it, but if you're reusing your old one, I would recommend some red Loctite on there. And I crank that thing in there as hard as I can turn this 1/4 inch Allen wrench. But you want to be careful that your hand doesn't slip off of there because you could slice it open pretty easily.
Starting tomorrow, this odd rice hack can change your life and help you drop up to 13 pounds week after week.
Don't forget to bring your belt back in front of the main shaft. I didn't loosen up the axle for this repair, and that's pretty normal that I can get everything kind of slid off and disassembled like this. But it does make getting the pulley back on slightly difficult. So what I typically do, I get the belt on the pulley, and then my dead blow fits pretty well like in between the face of the pulley and the swing arm. So I can just kind of stick it back there and then leverage the pulley forward just slightly and then rotate the main shaft and everything splines together. That's usually how it goes. And now that all of the oil seals are back in the transmission, I'm going to use this time to put the drain plug back in and fill the transmission full of fluid. And then I like to jack the bike up, spin the rear tire around. That way it walks the pulley and the belt back into its natural position on the transmission. Make sure everything's seated and sitting where it's supposed to. And then I lower the bike back down so that the rear wheel holds the belt and holds the pulley all in position. And it just makes it a little bit easier when we go to put the new nut on. Now the nut, you want to put fresh oil on one face of the nut that's going to be fitting up onto the pulley. And the new nut comes with lock patch on it. Using a new nut, like, it slides on the thread so smooth. No matter how well you clean up like an old sprocket nut, it always sucks. When you're torquing down the new nut, it just feels so much smoother. It's totally worth it. We're going to torque it down to 60 foot-pounds and then an additional 45 degrees. So I do obviously the 60 foot-pounds with a torque wrench. And then I put the socket back on there with my impact. And I use a permanent marker and just make draw a line from the face of the pulley onto the top of the socket. And then I just hit it with the impact enough to get the additional 45 degrees out of it. So right there is about 45 degrees. Everything's looking good there. When everything works out perfectly, that nut should be like flush with the end of the main drive gear. If the main drive gear is like recessed for whatever reason, you got a problem. But then we'll get our lock plate back up on there. And then you just flip it around to wherever the holes fit best. Then don't forget to torque them. We're going to put our front O-ring on. If you had a sprocket locking tool, it would fit in here just like this. If you don't have it like a really good impact, that's what you have to use. Honestly, it's a pain in the butt. It gets jammed in between the belt guard, and if you're using it a lot, it can be a real pain in the ass. But I'm just showing you. And then I like to get everything cleaned up before we're gonna have the primary on there. So the old compensating nut is gonna have a lot of oil and extra like leftover thread locker in there. So I use a pretty big pick with a 90-degree angle on it, and you can wedge it in there like pretty deep down into the root of the thread. And you'd be surprised how much crap will come out of there. Look at that. And that's a small fraction of it. And then we're going to do the exact same thing with the main shaft nut. Get in there, clean out all the threads, make sure all the oil's out of there, spray it down with brake cleaner. While you're in here, it's a good idea to pull the shaft adapter off and have a good look at the splines on the rotor. Sometimes they can get pretty hammered, and I've seen where the splines are, completely ripped out of the rotor. I like to have everything all cleaned up and laid out before we get the primary back in there. So we're going to get the new lock tab and oil seal on the jack shaft screw. They do need to go on in a special orientation, and this is the correct way that they go on there. You'll see that the lock tab has this funny little finger that hangs out on it, and it needs to index this slot that's in the jack shaft. So when you're tightening everything down, this little finger from the lock plate will go through the oil seal, and then it will index this little slot in the jack shaft, just like that.
Do this every morning to clear stuck mucus from lungs and breathe easy all day long. Short or weak breathing is easy to blame on the lungs, but that's not the whole story. The lungs are part of the solution, not the root cause. The main culprit behind short and weak breathing is the sticky, thick mucus coating the airways. This mucus acts like a barrier that blocks the oxygen from reaching the lungs. It also harbors pollution, smoke, and toxins that can cause inflammation, short breathing, and coughing. Eventually, the stuck mucus gets harder and stickier, making it almost impossible to cough up. But luckily...
But before any of that, we got to replace the seals in the inner primary. We're going to start with the jack shaft oil seal. We're going to use a 5/8 inch deep well socket. And from the back side, we're going to hit it. And it'll knock the oil seal out the opposite way. And while we're here, we're going to get the other oil seal out. Again, we're going to protect the edge of the aluminum. Just with a rag, we're just going to toss it on there. And then use our generic oil seal puller and just pop it right out. You want to make sure that you don't like dig in too far with that oil seal puller and like put a big gouge in the aluminum. You're just going under the face of the seal till you're under like the metal of the face, and then it'll just pop right out. And the new oil seal, if you get it from Harley Davidson, it'll say one side is for specifically like towards the oil, but you don't want to oil the outside of the seal. This is one of the seals where if you oil the outside of it, the seal will fall off. Like maybe not tomorrow, maybe not in a week, but you put it in dry. And then you just drive it in until it's flush with the aluminum machine surface there. And if you've been into this primary after somebody else has, if they've driven the jack shaft oil seal in basically any other way than this, probably the edge of the aluminum is rolled over on the face of it. And if that happens, I go in with my Dremel and I use this like little fiber kind of wheel, and it can go in there and polish up the edge of the aluminum. But the bore on this particular primary is in really good shape since nobody else has been in here before. So we're just getting in there with some brake cleaner and a Q-tip, getting all the dirt out of there. And this is that little fiber wheel. It's like a pretty tough, thick fiber. Where if I needed to, that's what I get in there with and smooth out the bore. Sometimes they're in terrible shape where somebody's really been beaten on it, and then you got to get in there with a small file and file like the walls of that bore flat, and it can be a real nightmare. But the easiest way to do this is use a 3/4 inch 6-point socket, and it'll kind of like you'll rotate the seal and it'll just click right in there. Lube up the outside of it with oil, just a little bit. And the seal will bottom out in its bore, so you just run it in there until it's bottomed out. Remove the socket and make sure you give it a good look over, because if the bore is jacked up, it'll usually cut like a flap of the rubber up, and you'll clearly see it. It'll be clear as day. You'll have to pop the seal back out, do whatever you need to clean up the bore and try a new seal. Before we put this inner primary on, we're going to oil up both of the seals. And then I always use a little bit of just black RTV silicone, and just the tiniest bit where it's just like a super small light coating just right around these areas, and it doesn't need to go on the top machined area like where the starter is, or around the front where the engine case O-ring is. Like, it needs zero up there. I've seen where people coat the O-ring with the RTV, and it just makes it a super nightmare to get off. But just put a little RTV on this little machined area and this rear little pad, and she'll be perfect.
When you sign up for Gusto, you get easy payroll, affordable payroll.
All right, and be careful not to drag that oil seal across the splines of the main shaft. And once it's pretty close to where it wants to go, I just tap it in with the bottom end of a hammer, because you don't want to like drag it into place with a head of a bolt or anything, because once you tap it with a hammer, it'll slide right in there. I get the shifter linkage hooked up so that it doesn't fall behind the primary and get jammed in behind something. So I just thread it in a couple threads by hand. You'll see the rear 3 bolts on this particular inner primary are all the same length, but we're going to put some Loctite on them and run them all in. And then we're going to torque them down. Now's a good time to go over and run the starter screws in and torque those down too. If your jack shaft assembly, like, it came apart or something while you had it, during the repair, this is the correct way that it fits together. Again, you want to get the special flat of the lock plate engaged with the flat that's on the shaft of the jack shaft. And then you want to torque it down. And don't forget to roll over the lock plate. And if your ear has the lock plates on the inner primary screws, you want to roll over those lock plates as well. Then we'll get the clutch hub and the front compensator assembly and the primary chain back in there. And you're going to want to put a couple drops of red Loctite on both the compensator nut and the main shaft nut. And then torque both the main shaft and the compensator nut. We'll get the snap ring back in there. And I go in with a flathead screwdriver and just the dead blow, just to make sure that snap ring is fully seated in its clip. You don't need to beat on it or anything, but just make sure it's fully seated. I have the spark plugs out of the engine, so I'm just going to put the primary chain tensioner up to kind of like where it used to be, and then use the starter button to rotate the engine over. But you got to be real careful that the bike's in neutral and that your fingers aren't in the primary chain, obviously, while you're using the starter button. But I like to do it this way. It's a little bit easier to do it than while the primary cover's on. And then you just set it to spec. The primary cover uses 2 different length screws.
Here's how to legally steal gasoline from gas stations. This programmer got fired from his job.
So you want to make sure you get them in the right spot. I'll use some arrows and kind of point out where the long ones and the short ones go. But you just put them in there and torque them down. Now all the hard parts are put back together. We just have to put the footboard back on, along with the passenger footboard.